It all started on a typical Monday morning. The conference room was packed, the kind of meeting no one wanted to be in, but everyone feigned interest. The air conditioning was colder than it needed to be, and the tension was almost palpable. I sat there with my laptop open, waiting for my turn to present a suggestion I'd been working on for weeks. It was a bold idea, something that could really improve the team's efficiency. When I finally spoke, my boss didn't even wait for me to finish. He laughed loudly. He looked at the others, scoffed, and said, "That idea is so bad it's a joke. You should focus on your real work." The room erupted in nervous laughter. My colleagues looked at me with disguised pity. I remained silent, but inside, something was changing. Right there, in that moment, as he humiliated me in front of everyone, a decision was silently being made that would change my life and destroy his empire. Before this episode, I was just another regular face in the office. I woke up early, took the same crowded bus every day with headphones on, trying to convince myself that everything was part of a bigger plan. I believed that if I worked hard, if I was loyal, if I brought good ideas, someone would eventually notice. I was the kind of employee who arrived before the boss and left after everyone else had left, always believing that effort and recognition went hand in hand. Naive? Maybe. But I really thought I was building something, or at least helping to build it. The reality, however, was quite different. What I didn't realize at the time was that the culture of that company was designed to keep people like me exactly where we were. Quiet, obedient, invisible. They sold the image of a modern, disruptive, people-like place. They had slogans on the walls. Think differently. Innovate every day. Here, everyone has a voice. But all of that was just makeup on top of an outdated, authoritarian structure. In practice, the voices that were heard were always the same. Those of the boss's friends, of the veterans who repeated recycled ideas as if they were gold. Anyone who dared to think outside the box was seen as a threat. And I, without knowing it, had become exactly that. Every time I proposed something new, I noticed suspicious looks. They were smiling, but there was a tension in the air, as if I had crossed an invisible line. At team lunches, I saw how favoritism ruled everything. Some people could make mistakes as much as they wanted, and they were protected. Others, like me, had to be perfect all the time. And even then, it wasn't enough. I remember one time when a colleague turned in an entire project late and was still publicly praised for having team spirit. That same month, I was reprimanded for using a different font in a presentation. It seemed minor at the time, but now I understand that it was just another cog in the devaluation mechanism they used to maintain control. They knew how to undermine people's trust without arousing suspicion, and it worked. I began to doubt myself. But what hurt the most wasn't even the lack of recognition. It was seeing good ideas being thrown away, seeing incredible opportunities being ignored because they came from the wrong people. That is, from those who weren't part of the inner circle. I saw the potential to transform processes, to automate tasks, to save time and money, but everything was treated with disdain. The company preferred to keep doing things the old way, because that way the boss maintained the feeling of control. He didn't want innovation, he wanted obedience. And I, who still believed in change, was a nuisance. Still, I hadn't given up. Not back then. I believed that eventually things would turn around. That eventually someone important would see the value of what I was trying to show. That's why I prepared so hard for that meeting. I studied the market, did benchmarks, and gathered real data. I created a lean, direct, and convincing slide deck. I spent days rehearsing, anticipating questions, and preparing answers. I thought I had finally found the opening. But instead, I found a wall of ego, sarcasm, and authoritarianism. And that's when I understood one of the bitterest truths of the corporate world. Winning doesn't always mean being accepted by those at the top. Sometimes winning means stopping trying to please those who will never recognize your value. After that meeting, something inside me snapped, but in a strange way. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger, it was a new kind of silence, as if my mind had hit an off button on the whole thing. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I didn't argue back, I just watched. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to prove something. I realized that this company wasn't the end for me. It was just the beginning. And that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't there to grow within that system, but to understand exactly how it worked, and how it could be broken. I walked out of that room with my head held high and a new purpose. He wasn't going to quit that day. Not yet. Because now I had a mission. And missions, unlike emotional outbursts, are quiet. They start with small steps, and every step I took from then on would be towards something bigger, something of my own. The company's culture was marketed as modern, flexible, and open to innovation. It was common to hear leaders talking about how they valued employee creativity, how the environment was conducive to out-of-the-box ideas, and how everyone could contribute solutions. But that was just the veneer. You only had to spend a little time there to realize that behind the cool facade, what really prevailed was a rigid hierarchical system, dominated by vanity, inflated egos, and an obsession with control. The colorful walls, the beanbags scattered throughout the hallways, the alternative playlist playing on the background music, and the ping-pong table next to the kitchen were nothing more than carefully placed distractions to mask the true environment, a place where creativity was stifled and conformity was rewarded. There, thinking differently was dangerous, and even more dangerous was wanting to change things. I began to notice the signs in the first few months. Ideas that made sense were ignored, while absurd decisions were defended tooth and nail by those who had some degree of power. Meetings were performance events. They were not about discussing solutions, but about reaffirming positions. The boss spoke and everyone agreed, even if logic was completely absent. The role of others was only to validate, not to question. And when someone like me dared to raise a question that had not been previously choreographed, the atmosphere froze. Smiles disappeared. Eyes averted. The leadership did not want to be challenged. They wanted applause. This became even clearer when I saw other colleagues who tried to present new proposals being marginalized, removed from the most important projects, placed in irrelevant tasks until they decided to leave on their own. It was a silent process of expulsion. No one was fired directly for daring to think, but everyone who did think ended up leaving. Despite this, I still resisted. I harbored the illusion that, with preparation, well-organized data, and a strategic presentation, I might be able to break this barrier. For a long time, I believed that the problem was in the way I expressed myself, and not in the system itself. This made me delve even deeper into studies, online courses, books on innovation, agile methodologies, lean culture, and successful startup cases. I wanted to speak the same language as the market. I wanted to be ready when the right opportunity came along, but what I didn't realize was that, in that environment, there was no right language. The system was stuck from the inside. The company didn't have a technical problem. It had a mindset problem. And this problem had a name: the boss. A man who was charismatic in the eyes of investors and completely toxic within the company. He knew exactly how to manipulate appearances. At industry events, he spoke about diversity, creativity, and disruption, with the same ease with which, internally, he humiliated subordinates for irrelevant details. His pleasure was in keeping people under control. It wasn't just about power, it was about ego. Any sign of brilliance from others was seen as a threat. He didn't just want to lead a team, he wanted to be the only one to be recognized. Any and all innovation had to come from him, or someone he considered close to him. That's why, when I presented my proposal at that meeting, it didn't matter how good it was. It hadn't come from the right person. It came from me. And in that environment, I was just another replaceable cog. When he ridiculed me, he wasn't just rejecting an idea. He was making it clear, in front of everyone, that there was no room there for anyone who dared to dream differently. But it was precisely at that moment that the seed was planted. I stopped trying to get through doors that were locked. I stopped trying to be accepted by a system that didn't want me. I began to observe in silence, to understand the company's mistakes, its weaknesses, its internal flaws. I analyzed the processes, the workflows, the bottlenecks that everyone ignored because it's always been that way. I began to mentally map out what could be done better. And most importantly, I realized that it wasn't just me who saw this. There were other frustrated people, dissatisfied customers, suppliers irritated by the bureaucracy, partners who complained about the rigidity of the system. The difference was that no one did anything about it. Everyone was stuck in the same logic, that it was safer to adapt than to confront. I understood that this was exactly where the opportunity lay. It was during this period that I began to study the startup ecosystem in more depth. Not just the success stories that have become cliches, but also the behind-the-scenes stuff. I understood how ideas that really change the game come about. I saw that disruption doesn't come from the top, it comes from the edges, from ordinary people who see a real problem and decide to solve it more efficiently. I realized that I didn't need anyone's approval to start something of my own. I just needed clarity about the problem, courage to act, and persistence to not give up at the first obstacle. I started gathering references, creating sketches, mapping out technologies. I started working in silence, after work hours, in the early hours of the morning, on weekends. While the company continued to ignore its failures, I turned them into fuel. But none of this happened in an explosive way. It wasn't a cinematic turnaround. It was a slow, disciplined, solitary process. I knew I couldn't just drop everything and walk out the door. Not yet. I needed to understand the game before I left the board. Every day I stayed at that company was an opportunity to observe, learn, collect data, and refine my plan. I turned my pain into study. I turned contempt into discipline. And little by little, without anyone noticing, I began to build something of my own. A parallel system, invisible to their eyes, but real. A simple but powerful idea. Something that could solve a problem that company pretended didn't exist. And when I finally showed it to the world, there would be no shouting, no confrontation. Just a better solution. And in time, the market would choose. And the market doesn't forgive the arrogance of those who ignore innovation when it knocks on the door. The turning point didn't come with a flash of genius, nor with an explosion of motivation. It was silent, almost invisible, like a root growing underground. While everyone around me continued to spin on the same wheels, pretending they were going somewhere, I began to take steps that no one noticed. At night, when I got home, I would open my laptop and dive into tutorials, spreadsheets, articles, forums, and videos from experts. I began to consume everything that could give me a competitive advantage, a differentiator. I studied lean business models, learned how to build MVPs, and understood how the idea validation cycle worked. And the more I studied, the clearer the image of what I wanted to build became. It was as if that entire toxic environment had served as a laboratory for me. I saw the mistakes, felt the side effects of outdated management, experienced firsthand what not to do, and that, even in the midst of pain, was gold. I started writing down random ideas. Small problems that I saw being ignored every day at that company started to connect in my head like pieces of a puzzle. A flawed customer service system, processes hampered by unnecessary bureaucracy, disconnected tools that delayed deliveries, the lack of integration between sectors that should operate in harmony. All of this formed a chaotic ecosystem that only worked on the basis of improvisation and pressure. But the market would not tolerate this forever. It was only a matter of time until something more agile, more accessible, and more intelligent emerged. And it was based on this that the idea of my future startup began to take shape. A platform that would unify processes, facilitate internal communication, and automate critical tasks, all in an intuitive, accessible, and scalable way. At first, it was all theory, but I knew I needed to turn the idea into something tangible. I started drawing the flows on paper. Then I used free prototyping tools. I created personas and mapped out the pain points of users I already knew very well, because I was one of them myself. I knew exactly where the friction was, where the frustrations arose, and that gave me an incredible advantage. It wasn't an outside perspective. It was pain that had been experienced, processed, and transformed into purpose. And while I was at work, I remained silent. I didn't show frustration, I didn't argue, I didn't confront anyone. I just did my job and observed. Every system error was a validation for me. Every angry customer, every lost process, every rework that arose fueled my conviction that I was on the right track. I didn't want to destroy the company. I wanted to surpass the model it represented. I started to save money with discipline. I cut unnecessary expenses, sold some things, canceled subscriptions, and limited my outings. I knew I would need a financial boost when I decided to leave. At the same time, I participated in online communities for entrepreneurs, joined discussion groups about technology and innovation, and engaged in silent networking with freelance developers and designers. I didn't say what I was building. I just listened, learned, and gathered informal feedback. During one of these conversations, I met a developer who had gone through a similar experience. He had been undervalued at an agency and decided to start his own business. We connected right away. He became my first technical partner. There was no money involved at the beginning, just the promise that if it worked out, we would share whatever came out. We started developing the first prototype, and like everything up until then, it was done in the silence of the early morning, between a cup of coffee and lines of code. The first MVP was simple. It didn't have a pretty design, It wasn't fast, but it worked. We could demonstrate the main functionality, a dashboard that centralized tasks and communication between teams more efficiently than any system my old company used. We tested it with friends, received feedback, and tweaked it. The process was slow because we still had our formal jobs, but each small improvement was a victory. When we finally had something usable, the question arose, how could we validate this with the real market? The answer came from where we least expected it. A former client of the company where I worked, who had already expressed dissatisfaction with their service, contacted me informally. He wanted to know if I knew of a better solution. I took a deep breath and decided to tell him part of the truth. I showed him our prototype. He agreed to test it. This first validation was a turning point. The client started using the system in parallel with the traditional process, and, in a short time, the results spoke for themselves. Communication between the departments of his company improved, deadlines were shortened, and rework errors were drastically reduced. I asked for detailed feedback. I wrote everything down. With each new use, we identified points for improvement. We refined it, and as this first company began to benefit, another one heard about it and wanted to learn more. And so, little by little, without any marketing campaign, without exposure on social media, without fanfare, we began to grow. The idea was alive, pulsating, and was beginning to prove itself useful. Throughout this period, I continued to maintain my position at the old company. On the outside, nothing had changed. I was just another silent employee, but on the inside, I had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. The contrast between what I was building at night and what I was witnessing during the day became more glaring every week. While on the inside, decisions were made based on vanity and hierarchies. On the outside, everything was validated by use, by real feedback, by concrete data. I began to feel a kind of freedom that I had never experienced before. A sense of belonging to something that I had created myself, and this gave me the strength to continue, even without recognition, without guaranteed stability, without knowing where it would all lead. But it also brought new challenges. The pressure was increasing. The fatigue accumulated from the double rounds was real. The fear of being discovered, of being fired before being ready, of losing everything due to some carelessness. It was a constant risk. So I made the decision to set a deadline. I had 3 more months to gather resources, improve the product, and gather the courage to leave for good. Until then, everything needed to be more solid. We defined clear goals, development priorities, made adjustments to the terms of use, created a basic visual identity, registered a domain, opened a CNPJ. Everything was still completely confidential. In the last month before my departure, another sign that we were on the right track appeared. An angel investor who had learned about the solution through one of our first clients contacted me. He wanted to talk, to understand better. I was shocked. This was real. I presented our idea, showed him the usage data, the expansion plans. He didn't close the deal right away, but he gave us the first sign of external trust. That was enough for me to not feel afraid on my last day at that company. I felt relief. I felt that for the first time, I was leaving not because of failure, but because I had built something with my own hands. And I left quietly, the same way I had come in, without fanfare, without speeches, just with a plan that, until then, only I knew completely. A plan that was about to change everything. Silently, I left that office for the last time with the feeling that I was carrying a secret that no one there would be able to understand. There was no formal farewell, no thank you speeches, no farewell party. It was the end of a cycle that was invisible to them, but deeply symbolic to me. I left without looking back, certain that the years spent there had not been in vain. They had taught me how not to lead, how not to innovate, how not to value people. And now all that distorted learning would be turned into real action. Coming home that day was different. It wasn't just the end of a job. It was the beginning of a life where, for the first time, everything I built would be mine. The responsibility was total. So was the fear. But there was something even stronger. The commitment to a cause that was now no longer an idea and had become a mission. The next day, I woke up early as usual, but I no longer wore the mask of an obedient employee. I sat down in front of the computer and started working full-time on my project. For the first time, I was able to dedicate my most productive hours to what really mattered. This made all the difference. The mental clarity, the freedom to test ideas without fear of punishment, the ability to make decisions based on purpose and not on internal politics. In just a few weeks, we were able to make more progress than in the previous months. The product began to take shape and mature. The features became more solid, the interface more intuitive, and above all, the system responded precisely to the real pain points of our users. Each update was a step forward, and the market response was not long in coming. Word of mouth grew. Small and medium-sized companies that suffered from the lack of integration and communication began to show interest in the platform. As interest grew, so did the first serious business meetings. And that's when I noticed an even starker contrast between my old reality and what I was experiencing. Before, any new proposal had to go through 5 layers of approval, each one slower than the last, until it was shelved due to lack of vision. Now, every conversation was direct. I spoke to the decision makers. I presented the problem, showed them how we could solve it, and saw the sparkle in their eyes of someone who had finally found a practical solution. It was liberating, and at the same time, frightening. Because now success or failure depended exclusively on me and the team that was forming. There was no one to blame, no place to hide. It was all or nothing. During this period, the relationship with the angel investor evolved. We presented a new version of the platform with usage metrics, customer testimonials, and growth projections. He was impressed with the progress and decided to invest an initial amount to scale the operation. With this investment, we were able to hire 2 more developers and 1 person to manage customer relations. The team, although small, was extremely aligned with the project's vision. Everyone had experienced, to some degree, the frustration of inefficient systems and toxic leadership. This created a different internal culture, more horizontal, more collaborative. No one needed to prove anything to anyone. The focus was on results, continuous improvement, and building something that would truly help people. With the team in action and the product more robust, we were able to win our first major client, a medium-sized company that operated in 3 states and suffered from a lack of standardization of internal processes. We migrated their systems in phases, trained the teams, and closely monitored the first 30 days. The results were visible: increased productivity, reduced rework, and greater satisfaction among employees. The company's CEO called us into a meeting and said something that has stuck in my memory. What you created should be a market standard. You are solving a problem that everyone pretends doesn't exist. At that moment, I was sure we were on the right track. But I also understood that, with visibility, the real test would come. It didn't take long for the echoes of our work to reach my old company. One of our new clients had canceled their contract with them to adopt our solution. The news circulated, first in whispers, then in more direct comments. A former colleague sent me a message. The boss freaked out when he found out. He sent a team to investigate who this startup is that's stealing our clients. I laughed silently. It was poetic. The company that had humiliated me now found itself threatened by the fruit of its own arrogance. And the most ironic thing was that everything we offered as a differentiator had already been suggested by me, years ago, within that same company. But at the time, they laughed. They ignored it. They disdained it. Now they had to deal with the effects of their own short-sightedness. But I didn't let that dazzle me. The goal was to grow consistently. We started to improve our business model, diversified plans, introduced new modules to the system, and created a more robust support center. At the same time, we began to map out other sectors that could be impacted by our solution. We discovered that areas such as logistics, health, and education also suffered from the same bottlenecks. This opened up new fronts. And once again, without major announcements or aggressive campaigns, our name began to gain ground. We were invited to events, innovation forums, and startup meetings. Little by little, what was born from a moment of humiliation began to be recognized as a reference. And the more we grew, the more my old company shrank. Not because of attacks or sabotage, but because they didn't know how to adapt. They tried to make up for lost time. They rushed to release updates, tried to copy features, and hired consultants to modernize their processes. But it was too late. The market had already realized that there was a solution that was more in line with reality. And in the world of innovation, timing is everything. If you take too long to understand the change, you miss the boat. They were trying to fix a ship while it was sinking. And with each new customer that migrated to our platform, the difference in approach became more evident. It wasn't just technology. It was philosophy. It was culture. It was a new way of seeing efficiency, empathy, and usability as parts of the same system. The symbolic turning point came at a tech industry event in San Francisco. We were invited to present our case study of sustainable growth and user-centric innovation. After the presentation, at the end of the second day of the event, I saw my old boss crossing the room, accompanied by two directors. When our eyes met, there was a brief silence. He stopped, seemed to try to remember where he knew me from. Then, he fixed his gaze. He recognized me, but he said nothing. He simply looked away and kept walking. And in that silent gesture, the entire narrative was condensed. He knew, and that was enough. There was no need for words. No "I win" would be more eloquent than that silent encounter where past and present collided for a few seconds. I didn't feel angry or arrogant. I felt peace. Because at that moment, I understood that true victory is not in taking revenge on those who brought you down, but in building something so strong that their downfall becomes just a natural reflection of your rise. And that's only possible when you transform pain into direction, frustration into discipline, silence into strategy. What started as a reaction became a project. What was born from trauma became a solution. And what seemed impossible became inevitable. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to point fingers. I just built something better. And in the end, that's what spoke loudest. History followed its course as if it were written by a force that did not accept shortcuts. After the event in San Francisco, we returned to the office with a sense of confirmation, but also with the weight of responsibility. We were on the radar. Opportunities that had previously seemed distant began to materialize quickly. Agendas with investment funds, invitations to renowned accelerators, emails from large companies that wanted to talk, to better understand how we had done so much with so little. The narrative of the startup that had been born in secret and overturned an outdated corporate model was not only inspiring, it was also profitable. And in the world of startups, nothing moves faster than a good story combined with a functional product. But it was precisely at this moment that discipline needed to be even greater. Because with growth came the risk of losing focus, of becoming dazzled, of starting to make decisions to please external expectations and no longer to solve the original problem. We knew this. And so we went back to basics. We reviewed our values, our goals, our mission. We remembered what motivated us in the beginning. It wasn't money or recognition. It was about solving a pain that hurt us. It was about creating something that didn't exist, and that if it did, would have saved so many people so much stress. This moral compass was what kept our structure firm as the pressure increased. With more clients came new demands, technical complexities, and the need to expand the team. Hiring people who shared our vision was one of the biggest challenges, because there is plenty of technical talent. But finding professionals who understand the reason for what we do, who respect the origin of our journey and are committed to excellence, requires more than interviews. It requires culture. And that is built with examples, with consistency, with difficult decisions. So we said no to brilliant candidates who lacked empathy. We turned down investment proposals that required us to change our essence. And we maintained the discipline of validating each step with real users, not with projection spreadsheets. During this process, I started to be approached by media outlets, podcasts, and innovation portals. They wanted to tell the story of the startup that was challenging the traditional model and winning. Whenever they asked me about the origin of it all, I hesitated for a second. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because it still hurt to remember that morning when I was ridiculed in front of everyone. The scene was still vivid. The sound of muffled laughter, the embarrassment, the heat on my face. It was a wound that was healing, but it still throbbed at times. And telling that to strangers was reviving a part of me that took a long time to reorganize. But at the same time, I knew it was necessary. Because there are thousands of people living different versions of the same story. Underestimated professionals, ignored ideas, talents repressed by blind structures. And if my story could serve as a beacon for someone who was on the verge of giving up, then it was worth revisiting the pain. Not as a victim, but as proof that it is possible to transform scars into foundations. In one of these interviews, the journalist asked what I would say if I were face to face with my former boss. The question caught me off guard. I remained silent for a few seconds, thinking. I had imagined this meeting so many times. I had rehearsed so many lines in my mind. But at that moment, I realized that I would say nothing, because there was nothing more to say. Reality had already spoken. What we had built spoke for us. And perhaps the greatest sign of maturity is understanding that some battles do not require revenge, only overcoming. And we had overcome them. With class, with intelligence, with hard work. We did not lower ourselves to the game of hostility. We created another game, with different rules, and we won on our field. This awareness began to permeate our external communication. We began to tell our story in lectures, but always focusing on what we learned, not what we suffered. We transformed past mistakes into lessons for the future. And in doing so, we attracted allies. Clients who had had similar experiences, leaders who were looking for a new way of managing, young talents who didn't want to enter environments where they would be just numbers. We began to be more than a platform. We became a symbol of a new work culture. And that was powerful, but it also carried weight, because it forced us to be consistent at all times. We couldn't repeat the mistakes we fought against. We couldn't allow growth to turn us into the same thing that hurt us. That's why we created internal rituals to remember who we are. Every first Monday of the month, we hold a culture meeting. In it, we reminisce about our early days, share our struggles, and celebrate our silent achievements. And at some point, someone always asks, what would the old version of the company we work for have done in this situation? And only after laughing and analyzing do we decide what we're going to do differently. This has become an internal mantra, a constant reminder that innovation isn't just about the product, it's about attitude. And leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about building an environment where people want to be, want to contribute, and want to grow. A few months later, we received the news that the company that had started it all had declared bankruptcy, officially. It was a strange moment. There was no celebration. There was no pleasure in seeing this happen, even though we knew it was the result of bad choices, of a culture that refused to evolve. What I felt was a kind of bitter confirmation. This was inevitable. They had been dead for a long time. They just hadn't accepted it yet. The structure collapsed because it was too fragile for the world that was emerging. And we survived because we grew from the pain, but without letting it corrupt us. We built on the trauma, but we didn't become bitter. On the contrary, it made us more empathetic, more attentive, more human. At that time, I started receiving messages from people who had worked with me at that company. Some asked for a chance. Others just said thank you. They said they remembered that day of humiliation, and that at the time, they had remained silent out of fear. That they regretted not having defended me. That they now understood the magnitude of it. I read each message with respect, and I responded to them all, not with judgment, but with understanding. Because I know that within oppressive systems, silence is often a survival mechanism. And knowing that now these same people saw my journey as an inspiration was, in a way, a form of justice. A justice that does not come from punishment, but from transformation. Over time, I realized that what we built was more than just an innovative product. It was living proof that there are other paths. That it is possible to get out of the pit without having to step on anyone. That it is possible to win without having to shout. That it is possible to grow with dignity, build with truth, and lead by listening. Our startup became profitable, scalable, and recognized. But what makes me most proud to this day are not the numbers, the contracts, or the awards. It is knowing that every line of code, every feature, and every process was designed with purpose. That every person who works with us feels part of something bigger. That no one there needs to hide ideas or bow their head to someone else's ego. This is, for me, the real disruption. It's not just technology. It's culture. It's the way we treat people. How we listen to voices. How we respond to the pain of others with construction, not revenge. In the end, it all started with a no. A harsh, mocking, public no. But it was transformed into momentum, in direction, into a new system. An ecosystem where ideas are not ridiculed, where talents are not stifled, where no one needs to become a machine to be valued. And if someone asked me today what I gained from all this, I would say, freedom. The freedom to be who I am, to create with purpose, to lead with awareness, and, most importantly, to prove that even the greatest humiliations can become the fertile soil from which the greatest revolutions sprout. All in silence, all with strategy, all with courage. Silence was my greatest weapon. Not the passive silence of someone who accepts injustice and lowers their head, but the strategic silence of someone who observes, calculates, and builds without needing to show off. In a world where everyone wants to speak louder, post more, show off more, I chose to work in the dark. While others worried about appearing busy, I dedicated myself to being effective. While my old company made speeches about innovation without actually changing anything, I created a product that silently fixed exactly the problems they ignored. It was as if each of their mistakes had taught me what not to do. And with each step I took, the feeling of being on the right path only grew. But don't think it was easy. There were times when I doubted myself, when the fear of failure spoke louder, when the lack of applause almost made me stop. Because creating in silence requires a strength that not everyone is willing to develop. You don't have an audience. You don't have immediate approval. You only have your vision, your mistakes, and the will to continue even when no one seems to believe you. The interesting thing is that, contrary to what I initially imagined, revenge was never the main fuel. In the beginning, yes, there was anger, an intense desire to prove my worth, to show the world, and especially my old boss, that he was wrong, that his humiliation had been unfair, that his arrogance would cost him dearly. But over time, as my idea took shape, that feeling began to transform. Anger gave way to focus. Hurt pride became discipline, and the desire for revenge was replaced by a much broader mission, to create something that made sense, that solved a real problem, that freed other people from the same kind of oppression I faced. Because when you start building with purpose, your ego is no longer the center. What matters is no longer proving something to someone, but contributing to something that goes beyond yourself. Even so, it is impossible to ignore the irony of the facts. The company that emotionally fired me in that meeting, that ridiculed me in front of the team, that made a point of reminding me that I was just one more, was defeated by an idea that was born precisely from the pain they caused, and not by direct confrontation. There was no sabotage. There was no attack. It was simply the market choosing a better solution. It was the public saying, "We will not accept the old man in disguise again." And that, to me, was the most elegant justice possible. I did not need to return the humiliation. I simply showed what happens when you underestimate someone who has the courage to transform their own pain into creative fuel. Someone who chooses to act while others still try to win by shouting louder. This silent victory manifested itself in many ways. In the messages I received from clients thanking me for finally finding a solution that respected their time and intelligence. In the testimonials from teams that enjoyed their work again after adopting our system. In the invitations to share our journey at events that previously seemed inaccessible. And most importantly, in the way we became a reference for other startups. Not as a model of quick success, but as proof that it is possible to win with values. That consistency overcomes impulse. That ethics are not an obstacle. They are a differentiator. In an ecosystem often dominated by exaggerated promises and toxic cultures of growth at any cost, we became an alternative. A possible path for those who want to innovate without betraying their principles. And it was in this context that a new challenge arose. As the company grew, we began to be approached by large corporations interested in partnerships, mergers, and even acquisitions. $1 million proposals began to appear. Some were extremely tempting. Others were blatantly opportunistic. And at this point, it was easy to understand how many startups lose their essence. Success attracts attention, and with attention comes the pressure to scale faster, earn more, grow at any cost. But we had already learned what happens when a company grows while ignoring the values that sustain its existence. So, we created an internal rule. No strategic decision would be made without going through a single question. Does this bring us closer or further away from our original mission? This simple question became a powerful filter. It prevented us from embarking on adventures that would have compromised our essence, and it reinforced to everyone on the team that our commitment was to the integrity of what we were building. It was at that moment that I began to realize the real impact of the journey we were on. Not just on the product, but on the people. I saw professionals gain confidence when they knew their ideas would be heard. I saw leaders emerge within the team, not because of status, but because of their real contribution. I saw talents flourish simply because, for the first time, they were in an environment that didn't crush them. This culture we created, of listening, of respect, of collaboration, was, to me, the true product of the company. Technology was just the means. What set us apart was the way we did things. And that way had been born back then, in that moment of pain, in that meeting room where they silenced me. Little did they know that, by trying to silence me, they had lit the spark of something much bigger. From then on, our work began to expand beyond the product. We created educational initiatives to train young people in technology, especially those who, like me, came from environments where no one believes in you. We offered scholarships, mentoring, and created a culture of providing access before demanding results. We began investing in research on well-being at work, sustainable productivity, and mental health in corporate environments. Not because it gave us marketing, but because it was the right thing to do. And because we knew, from our own experience, what neglecting these issues can cause. All of this transformed the startup into a movement, something that grew beyond reports, that left its mark on people, that built a new narrative about what is possible when you undertake with purpose. Of course, there were mistakes along the way, decisions that needed to be reviewed, features that didn't perform as expected, partnerships that didn't bear fruit. But each mistake was treated as a learning experience, not as blame. And this was also part of the culture we created, a culture of adjustment, honest feedback, and constant growth. Instead of punishing those who fail, we sought to understand the context, correct the process, and support the new beginning. This approach made the team more engaged, more loyal, and more committed. People didn't work out of fear or pressure. They worked because they felt part of something that made sense. And this, in the long term, is what differentiates companies that survive from companies that make history. Today, when I look back, I clearly see the value of each step. The suffering that seemed unjustifiable, the loneliness that seemed unbearable, the closed doors, the silent humiliations, all of this was building material. Bricks that, stacked patiently, became a foundation. The pain, which seemed like a useless weight, became a direction. Every no I received, every scorn, every look of disdain, now echoes differently. They didn't know it, but they were training me, preparing me, giving me exactly what I needed to create something that would surpass them. And today, I know that this is the best answer. Not the noisy answer that screams revenge, but the answer that is built with time, with work, with results. The answer that doesn't need to be announced. Because it imposes itself. It is there, for whoever wants to see it. And it says, "You tried to put me out, but you only lit my flame." And it was in silence that I learned to set the world on fire. There was a moment during this journey when I realized that the story we were writing was no longer just mine. At first, it all felt very intimate. The pain of humiliation, the loneliness of the beginning, the fear of failure. These were feelings that I carried as if they were exclusively mine, sealed within a personal narrative. But as the company grew, as more people approached me, as more stories connected to mine, I realized that this experience was no longer just an isolated case, but something collective, almost archetypal. It was as if, by breaking the silence and building something on it, I had unlocked a language that many people understood but still didn't know how to articulate. And it was at that moment that I understood the true power of what we had done. We weren't just delivering a product, a functional platform. We were offering permission for others to also rise up, to also build, to also respond to pain with purpose. This awareness redefined the way we dealt with everything. We began to see our mission not only as a response to the system that had hurt us, but as a clear proposal for the future. It was not about taking revenge on the old corporate culture. It was about offering a real alternative. And for this alternative to be credible, sustainable, and scalable, we needed an even more solid foundation. We invested in structure, in internal governance, in good practices that would allow us to grow without betraying our essence. Each department began to operate autonomously, but with interdependent responsibility. We developed active listening policies. We created rotating internal councils, where any employee could propose strategic ideas. Hierarchy gave way to clear roles. And with that, the company gained speed. Because when everyone knows they have a voice, fear gives way to creativity. And innovation ceases to be just a goal and becomes a natural consequence of the environment. Meanwhile, parallel stories continued to arrive. People from different sectors, ages, and cities wrote to report situations similar to the one I had experienced. People who had been silenced, underestimated, and punished for daring to propose something new. Professionals who had brilliant ideas in their pockets but had already convinced themselves that it was better not to try. In many of these stories, there was a tone of resignation, as if they had already accepted that the world was just like that, and that it wasn't even worth fighting for. These messages affected me deeply, because I knew exactly what this kind of silence meant. I had lived through it. And so I understood that many of these people didn't need ready-made formulas or empty motivational phrases. They needed examples, real proof, stories that showed, with all their ups and downs, that it is possible, that pain can be used as fuel, that even when everything seems to conspire against you, there is still a way, there is a choice. That's why we decided to institutionalize what we call the Origin Circle, a space within the company dedicated exclusively to hearing stories from other professionals who have gone through similar experiences. It wasn't meant to become content or advertising, it was meant to listen, welcome, and provide space. We created a small team that read each story, responded, offered volunteer mentoring, and connected people with resources that could help them get out of their emotional stagnation. In a short time, this movement took on a life of its own. External partners wanted to support it. Renowned professionals offered to help. And what started as a symbolic gesture became a robust initiative with social impact. We didn't know this would happen. But when you work with truth, the results are always greater than planned. And the most curious thing was to realize that, by hearing so many stories of pain, frustration, and injustice, we ended up reaffirming even more the foundations of our own culture. It was as if each story served as a constant reminder of what we could not become, of the responsibility we carried, not only to maintain a healthy company, but to preserve the spirit that gave rise to it. And that is not easy, because the more you grow, the more the world tries to mold you. The more you are pressured to follow already established standards, to have aggressive goals, to cut costs in the name of efficiency, to make impersonal decisions. But if there is one thing I have learned along this journey, it is that growth without coherence is just inflating a punctured balloon. It rises quickly, attracts attention, but soon implodes. And we did not want that. We wanted growth that would last, that would be sustained not by haste, but by depth. During this period, I met up with some of the colleagues who were present at the fateful meeting where I was humiliated. Some sought me out of their own free will. Others I met at events by chance. There were those who apologized, those who admitted that they laughed out of fear, those who said that if they could go back in time, they would have done things differently. I listened to everything with respect. I never judged, because I understood that at that moment, everyone was trying to survive in a suffocating environment. And in environments like that, self-protection often disguises itself as omission. There were also those who still tried to minimize my journey, as if what we had achieved was an exception, a stroke of luck, a coincidence of factors. But that no longer affected me, because I knew how much we had fought, how many nights we had spent adjusting lines of code, how many no's we had faced, how many doubts we had. The road had been too long for any external comment to have the power to destabilize us. This stance gave us even more strength to continue with consistency. We reinvested part of our profits in grassroots projects, supporting peripheral communities with access to digital education. We established partnerships with universities to offer real paid internships, with practical training and mentoring. And none of this was a branding strategy. It was a continuation of what we believed from the beginning. Talent is everywhere. What is lacking is opportunity. And if our trajectory could serve as a bridge to other invisible talents, then it was our obligation to reach out. Because it was precisely the lack of opportunities back then that almost made me give up. And because I know that there are thousands of professionals like me, with incredible ideas, trapped in environments that insist on extinguishing any sign of authentic brilliance. By this point, our startup had already established itself as a reference in the sector. We had won awards, been invited to contribute to public innovation policies, and opened offices in other countries. But as grand as all of this seemed, what moved me the most was still something very simple. Seeing someone using our platform with relief. Seeing teams communicating again. Seeing managers listening to their teams better. Seeing ideas being accepted naturally and not with suspicion. This was the true measure of our impact. And each time I witnessed this, I went back to that first day, in that cold room, hearing my boss say that my idea was a joke. And I understood that he was wrong not only about the idea, he was wrong about me, and about all the others who, like me, had been treated as invisible. It all comes down to this: transformation. Turning silence into action, fear into courage, frustration into creativity. And more than that, transforming your own destiny with the tools available, even if they are scarce, improvised, limited. Because when you have clarity of purpose, even the simplest tools become powerful. And when you act truthfully, even the smallest gesture reverberates more than any noisy campaign. I didn't need to raise my voice for them to hear me. I just needed to build something that spoke for me. And that's what I try to say to those who ask me how to start over after being emotionally destroyed by a toxic environment. Don't shout. Build. Don't argue with those who don't want to listen. Prove it. Don't get lost trying to fit into a place that was made to diminish you. Create your own space. Because the world doesn't need more obedient people. It needs people who, even if broken, rebuild themselves with purpose, and who make this new path a road that others can also follow. The journey that began with a silent humiliation ended with a solid, respected company and a culture that impacted people far beyond the walls of the office. But it wasn't the end. The end of that story was just the beginning of something much bigger. The profound understanding that all systems are changeable when someone has the courage to question them. And I'm not just talking about the business system, the hierarchical structures, and the traditional corporate culture. I'm also talking about the internal system, the set of beliefs that each of us carries, and that often limits us much more than any boss. When I was ridiculed in front of everyone, what hurt wasn't just what he said. It was what I believed at that moment. For a few moments, I gave in to the humiliation. I lowered my eyes, silenced my ideas, doubted myself. And if I hadn't rebuilt that belief through effort, silent work, and the almost invisible step-by-step, this story wouldn't have unfolded the way it did. This internal reconstruction was perhaps the biggest challenge, because pain leaves deep scars. You can change your environment, create new projects, even achieve financial success. But if you are not able to rebuild the way you see yourself, there will always be a part of you stuck in that moment of rupture. For a long time, I carried that scar, a constant echo of that meeting, of my former boss's laughter, of the team's contemptuous looks. It was as if, even building everything from scratch, I still had to prove something, not only to the world, but to myself. And this silent, self-inflicted pressure pushed me into endless journeys of delivery. The fast pace of the startup, combined with my need for validation, almost made me unconsciously repeat the same mistakes I criticized so much. The difference is that now I was the one in charge, and I had to stop, look in the mirror, and admit, beating others is only part of it. Beating yourself is the real challenge. It was at this point that I decided to seek help. Talk to therapists, mentors, people who could help me sort out everything that was happening, because I knew that if I didn't treat the root cause, I would end up replicating the same logic of oppression under a different name. The difference between a toxic leader and a committed visionary is subtle, and lies in intentions, but also in limits. I learned to recognize my own patterns of exhaustion, to delegate without losing control, to trust without giving up excellence. And above all, I learned to forgive. Not in the romantic sense, but as an emotional survival strategy. To forgive those who hurt me, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to continue. I deserved to not carry that burden. I deserved to walk lighter. And that was a turning point. My relationship with the team changed, my pace changed, my long-term vision became clearer, and I began to understand that the company no longer needed to be a shield against the past. It could be a bridge to the future. From this maturity, our positioning in the market also evolved. We went from a promising startup to a reference in healthy organizational culture. We were invited to collaborate on educational initiatives, to offer consulting services to companies undergoing transformation, to develop products designed not only for performance, but also for well-being. And this was not an expansion strategy. It was a consequence. Because when you build something based on a real experience, the world recognizes it. There is a difference between companies that say they care about people and companies that were founded based on a person's real pain. The truth has a smell, a texture, a behavior. It communicates itself without needing to be forced. And it was this truth that opened doors for us, often without even having to knock on them. And even with all this expansion, we kept the essence alive. The same room where it all started was still used for strategic meetings. The first team that believed in the project was still part of the important decisions. The rituals of listening and reflection continued to happen every week. We even created an internal panel called Ideas That Were Almost Ignored, where any employee could share a proposal of theirs that, at some point in their life, was disregarded. From then on, we began to welcome these ideas, refine them, and give them a chance to flourish. It was more than an exercise in innovation. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of saying, here, you will be heard. Here, silence will not be a punishment. And this created an environment that many people described as the first place where they felt safe to be who they really were. Over time, we were recognized for this. We received awards for innovation, social impact, and organizational culture. But the most valuable of all came in an unexpected form. Once, during a lecture at a university, I was approached by a shy student who handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. In it, he said that he had an idea that had been shelved for years. He had already shown it to 2 different bosses, at 2 different jobs, and was ridiculed in both. He thought about giving up, but after watching our story, he decided to try again. He created a simple prototype and, with the help of friends, launched a beta version. The project started small, but it was growing, and he just wanted to say thank you for showing that it is possible. The letter ended with a simple sentence. Your story gave me permission to continue. I kept that letter like an invisible trophy, because it represents everything I would have liked to have heard that day in the meeting where I was silenced. And because, in the end, that is what matters, what we leave in others. Today, my relationship with the past is one of respect, not of blind gratitude nor of latent resentment, just respect. I understand that if I had not gone through that experience, I might never have had the urgency to create something new. But I also understand that nothing justifies humiliation, contempt, or the culture of oppression. That is why I choose to remember the past not as something to be exalted, but as something to be overcome. And every time I tell this story, it is not to portray myself as a hero. It is to show that we all have, at some point, a crossroads where we can choose to repeat or to rebuild, to be one more person within the system, or to be someone who questions the system, to be silent or to transform. And this choice, however lonely it may seem at first, is never in vain, because by transforming our own history, we inevitably create space for others to do the same. This is the final reflection I carry with me, the idea that no act of courage is too small. No attempt at reconstruction is useless. No story of pain needs to end where it began. The journey that began with humiliation has become a movement, a constant reminder that silence can be a place of resistance, that resilience can be silent, yes, but never passive, and that the best response to any attempt to silence us will always be creation, because what you build with purpose, no one can take away. No shouting, no humiliation, no contempt is capable of erasing what was created with soul. And in the end, that is what remains. Not the voices that tried to diminish us, but the spaces we opened so that others could grow. Not the mocking laughter, but the echoes of transformation. Not the empty applause, but the lives we touched, even without knowing it. And if everything we do is in the name of this, then it will be worth it. Even if no one is watching. Even if it is in silence.